Charlotte discovers that she has been chosen to marry King George of England, despite her reservations. On the day of the wedding, she escapes and meets George, who introduces himself as just George, and not the king. They have a conversation, and Adolphus interrupts, allowing Charlotte to make her decision about marrying George. The ceremony proceeds, but afterward, George reveals that he has prepared a separate house for Charlotte and intends to live separately. Charlotte is upset and confronts George, but he insists on living apart. Brimsley, Charlotte's attendant, follows her as she explores her new home. After many years, Queen Charlotte summons her children and demands they find suitable spouses to produce legitimate heirs. She expresses concern over the lack of legitimate grandchildren and the crisis it poses for the monarchy. Queen Charlotte wakes up on her honeymoon and realizes she has no official duties for the week. Lord Bute expresses concerns about the marriage not being consummated, which could jeopardize the great experiment. Charlotte feels isolated and neglected by her husband, King George. Lady Danbury advises Charlotte on the importance of consummating the marriage to secure her position. Charlotte considers going back home if they are not truly married. Meanwhile, Violet Bridgerton and Lady Danbury discuss the importance of love in marriage. Charlotte meets with Violet and seeks advice on getting her sons to marry. Brimsley and Reynolds discuss the king's reluctance to consummate the marriage. Lady Danbury meets with Princess Augusta and hints at revealing something to the queen. Charlotte confronts George about his behavior and they reconcile. The king and queen return home, and Charlotte questions the restrictions on their travel together. They decide to start over and try again. The palace staff prepares for the coronation as tensions rise between Reynolds and Brimsley. The coronation takes place, but behind closed doors, as the king and queen's relationship is strained. Lady Danbury plans a ball, but Princess Augusta faces pressure to cancel it. Queen Charlotte discovers a garden and seeks independence, while King George finds solace in farming. Lady Danbury advises Queen Charlotte to endure for the sake of their side. Queen Charlotte begins to assert herself, making her own choices and reflecting on her position as queen. The king and queen's relationship becomes more complicated, alternating between intimacy and detachment. The tension between Lady Danbury and Princess Augusta escalates as the fate of the ball hangs in the balance. Later, Queen Charlotte wakes to a mysterious sound and she gets out of bed to find King George frantically writing on a wall and muttering to himself. Seeing her, he walks out. She follows him outside, where he calls out to Venus. Reynolds and Brimsley rush to action. When George ignores Reynolds, Queen Charlotte steps in saying that she is Venus, and makes him come inside. Queen Charlotte and Reynolds express concern over King George's unusual behavior and deteriorating health. In a flashback, Princess Augusta informs King George that she has found him a German bride and urges him to fulfill his duty by producing an heir. Doctors debate the cause of the king's condition, with Dr. Monro suggesting a nervous disorder. Princess Augusta entrusts Dr. Monro with the task of treating the king. Monro employs extreme and controversial methods, subjecting King George to physical and psychological torment. Despite initial resistance, King George starts to show signs of improvement. He becomes determined to reconnect with Queen Charlotte and attempts to escape Monro's treatment. King George's condition improves further when he spends time with Queen Charlotte. In the present, King George wakes up alone and sees the writing on the wall. He sees the Queen's carriage leaving for Princess Augusta. Charlotte fights with Augusta and tells her that the king is mad. Augusta denies those allegations and all this ruckus is overheard by King George, who walks back to Dr. Monro to continue his treatment. During an opera performance, Violet discusses with Lady Danbury how lonely the queen must be, surrounded by people but lacking companionship. As the story progresses, Lady Danbury mourns her husband's death and realizes she must navigate life as a widow. Meanwhile, Queen Charlotte discovers she is pregnant and writes letters to the king, seeking his attention. Reynolds takes the letter to the king but is turned away after he witnesses the king's suffering. Reynolds meets up with Queen Charlotte and she asks him about the king's whereabouts. Dr. Monro steps in and says that it's impossible for her to see King George right now. So, Reynolds directs her to King George. She discovers King George in a tortured and restrained state and demands his release. She urges him to regain his sanity and reminds him of their child. They share a tender moment, and the Queen expresses her concern for his happiness and soul rather than just his sanity. She dismisses Dr. Monro, who also desires the king's sanity, but the Queen prioritizes his well-being. She then informs Brimsley that they will be moving to Kew. Dr. Monro, who has been dismissed as King George's doctor, meets with Princess Augusta. She demands an explanation for his dismissal. Dr. Monro reveals that the king required intensive private treatments, but he cannot divulge further details. Later, Queen Charlotte visits King George, who initially rejects her presence, expressing his desire for her to return to Buckingham Palace. Despite his resistance, she refuses to leave and insists on staying by his side. Queen Charlotte proclaims her love for him, assuring him that she understands his need for solitude and is willing to respect his wishes. Initially hesitant, King George eventually confesses his love for her and reveals his lifelong secret illness. Later, Princess Augusta visits Kew and demands to see King George. Queen Charlotte denies her request, emphasizing that the king does not wish to receive visitors. Princess Augusta expresses concern about King George's ability to rule and insists he faces Parliament. Queen Charlotte relays the message to King George, leading to their return to Buckingham House. Queen Charlotte watches as King George writes his speech for Parliament. Suddenly, she announces the arrival of their baby. King George calls for assistance and the royal doctor prepares for the birth. Later, King George cradles their newborn son, proud and declaring him the future king. Later, Charlotte accompanies George as he prepares to address Parliament. His hands tremble with anxiety, but she encourages him to proceed. However, as they arrive, King George's anxiety overwhelms him, and he cowers on the carriage floor, unable to continue. Charlotte learns of his distress and finds him hiding under the bed. She joins him, pledging her unwavering love and support. Later on, a royal ball is thrown for the celebration of the newborn prince. King George and Queen Charlotte enjoy each other's company and pledge to be together forever. In the present, Queen Charlotte arrives at Kew to visit King George, who is again inscribing on walls. Seeing her, he hides under the bed where they recreate their scene from their youth as she tells him that their son, Edward, has now become a father and their lineage will continue. Queen Charlotte smiles as the season ends.